Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lesson we're going to be discussing techniques for teaching with the preservation of our faith in mind. Now, though the doctrines and principles that we espouse and hold to be true are eternal in themselves, the fact is that they are never more than one generation away from extinction, and it is perilous to pretend otherwise, and equally perilous not to do what we can to preserve the faith. Now, the attainment of knowledge, theological knowledge, is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. Its ultimate usefulness is manifest when we spread the knowledge to others so that it can be preserved and used for the next generation. So knowledge, it's all well and good to acquire knowledge for oneself, but the ultimate benefit of it is in the sharing of it and spreading of it. And it's comparable to a seed in a field, and that you have to spread it around for anything to grow. And as the psalmist writes in Psalm 145, verses 4 and 7, generation after generation praise your works, and they declare your mighty acts. They send forth the remembrance of your great goodness, and they sing of your righteousness. This is the solemn duty and sacred obligation of every generation, and we are to keep the Spirit alive, and we are very much instructed to in the Great Commission, which in Matthew's version, Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20, we witness an emphasis on teaching in the role of Great Commission, which is the spreading of the good news to the four corners and the ends of the earth. And it reads, "Therefore go and instruct all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Ruach Kadesh, teaching them to guard all that I have commanded you. And see, I am with you always, until the end of the age. Amen." So in both verses we have the word instruct and teach, which are more or less synonymous and interchangeable. And that we are to teach is self-evident, but how and what we are to teach requires additional instruction, and our aim is to make disciples. And a disciple, by definition, is one who mimics the model of the master. So we are to do as he would do, think as he would think, and be what he wants us to be. We're to go where he wants us to go, say what he wants us to say, do what he wants us to do, and be what he wants us to be. And that is the ultimate aim of the Great Commission. And it is impossible for it to be realized or manifest in the absence of teaching or instruction. And we also read in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, that teaching, we're not only to teach, our students are not only to be learners, but we're to instruct, equip them for the task of teaching the next generation, because remember, this is a chain, a cosmic chain from one historical generation to the next, and we owe it to our posterity to equip the people we teach, to enable them in order to teach. And that verse reads, "And what you have heard from me among many witnesses, entrust these to trustworthy men who shall be competent to teach others as well." This is Paul writing to Timothy, a pastoral protege whom he held in affectionate regard, and dedicated 2 pastoral epistles instructing him on the duties and obligations and qualifications of the pastor position. And teaching clearly features prominently in the instruction and imperative. And now we're going to turn to the return back to the Old Covenant, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. "And this is the command, the laws and judgments which Yahweh your Elohim has commanded to teach you to do in the land which you are passing over to possess, so that you fear Yahweh your Elohim, to guard all his laws and his commands which I command you, and your sons and your grandsons all the day of your life, and that your days be prolonged. And you shall hear, O Israel, and shall guard to do, that it might be well with you, and that you increase greatly, as Yahweh your Elohim of your fathers has spoken to you, a land flowing with milk and honey." So the writer of this, being Moses, has more than the present generation in mind. He mentions the sons and grandsons, and they were to possess the land that they had only beheld. They had the promised land, which they had not yet laid claim of, but these instructions were to guide them, and they were to remember all that their ancestors endured in order to claim the promised land. And we read of a similar principle returning to the New Testament in Ephesians 6, 1 through 4, which reiterates the Decalogue principle, the fifth commandment of respect for parents, because parents are the ones to whom are our primary teachers. Now, we cannot rely on education, especially when theology is very much in the midst of being placed on the endangered species list as an academically legitimate subject. It is more than ever incumbent for parents to instruct the children at home and have a church and assembly perform the same function. But we are to teach in all ways, however we can, in whatever ways we can. And the verse reads, this is the first 4 verses of the 6th chapter: "Children, obey your parents in the master, for this is right. Respect your father and mother, which is the first command with promise, in order that it might be well with you, and that you might live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children, but bring them up in instruction, in admonition of the master." So this is instructing fathers how to instruct their children, not to chastise them or discipline them physically for its own sake, but really to be gentle, because that is the essence of the faith. And this comes attached with the promise. Now, the abiding and adhering to these principles can not only add life to our years, but years to our life. So it's ultimately qualitative as well as quantitative benefit. And it obey your parents. Now, parents, they know more than we know. They've experienced. Now, every young person knows what it's like to be young, but none of them can claim to know what it's like to be old. So we really owe it to our elders to respect them, because they know what it's like to be old and young. So they know more than we know. They've experienced things that we haven't experienced, and we can benefit from them. But this is wholly contingent on our showing them the due deference and respect for what they may teach us. And we're going to return to the book of Deuteronomy, 32, chapter 32, verses 44 through 47. "Then Moses came with Joshua, son of Nun, and spoke all the words of this song in the hearing of the people. And when Moses ended speaking all these words to all Israel, he said to them, 'Lay your heart on all the words which I warn you today, so that you command your children to guard to do all the words of this Torah. For it is not a worthless word for you, because it is your life, and by this word you prolong your days on the land which you pass over the Jordan to possess.'" So the word is very much valuable. It is not worthless. It is a source of life. He speaks of it in life and death terms, I believe, in the 30th chapter of Deuteronomy, and he re-amplifies that concept with the Mosaic law. And Joshua was his designated successor, who would ultimately lead them past the Jordan River to lay claim of the promised land. But the law which Moses had set in stone was to be their governing principle, which was to guide their worship, their conduct, their civil law, their ceremonial precepts, and also their moral dictates. And it was really incumbent that it be taught, because if it's not taught, it vanishes. It evaporates into the sands of history, never to be recovered again. So in each generation, in theirs as much as ours now, we are indebted to them for much of what we know, and we owe it to our progenitors and our posterity to pass what is true and valuable, because this word is not worthless. It is of supreme value, of preeminent value, in fact, and it gives meaning to life, and without it, life is not worth living. Having made it a central component of my life, I cannot simply imagine going back to the old self and that's ultimately maybe a little more personal than the discourse direction should take. But we're going to turn to Psalm 44:1, and it says, "O Elohim, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have related to us, the work you did in their days, in the days of old." So we gather by the Psalms, which were written at a later period than the Mosaic Law, the initiation of the Old Covenant, that the traditions and history had been preserved orally and written, and it was commemorated in Psalms such as these. So it is, and we also read in Psalm 78, verses 1 through 8, a more extensive coverage of the same concept, these being the words of Asaph. "My people, give ear to my Torah, incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I open my mouth in a parable, I utter riddles of old, which we have heard and known, for our fathers have declared to us. We do not hide from their children, declaring to the generation to come the praises of Yahweh, and his strength and his wonders, which he has done. For he raised a witness in Jacob, and put a Torah in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, to teach them to their children, that it might be known to a generation to come, to children who would be born, to rise up and declare to their children, and place their trust in Elohim, and not forget the works of El, but watch over his commands, and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation which did not prepare its heart, whose spirit was not steadfast to El." Now there's a lot to digest in these 8 verses, so we're going to approach it from the top. What he has to say is important, so he opens with the imperative injunction to take heed and listen carefully to what he has to say, because it is important. What he's saying is not useless chatter, but of supreme significance. And a parable is a literary device. We've done a few of those. For more information on that, ultimately, I feel it would be distracting if I elaborated on it. And which we have heard and known, so they were receiving these oral histories and written histories from their progenitors or ancestors. So the Exodus experience all the way to the national history of Israel was preserved all the way up to Asaph, who was, I believe, a post-exilic writer. "And we do not hide from our children." Now what we have to say is not, the way of the gospel is transparent, because it is true, and it's not to be concealed or suppressed. It's to be proclaimed publicly and proudly, and declaring to the generation to come. So this is with the future in mind. We're making an investment in the future when we pass on what our progenitors or ancestors have learned for our benefit. And the praises of Yahweh, his strength and wonders, he is the object of our worship and our study, and it is by studying his attributes that we may reflect them in our interactions with others, and ultimately progress to become more like him, which is the worthiest goal we can attain. And he raised a witness in Jacob. Jacob is another name for Israel. He was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, the son of Isaac, through whom the seed of promise passed. And the law was through Moses, who was a descendant of Levi, one of Jacob's 12 sons. And he commanded our fathers to teach them to their children, so it wasn't just for their generation alone, but it was to be passed on in order for it to govern them throughout their national history. And that it might be known to a generation to come, and to children who would be born, to raise up and declare to their children. So again, we witness the necessity of the continuum of teaching from one generation to the next, and the flame which is lit by one generation is not to be extinguished, because, as I said in the opening discourse, the faith is